Hello and welcome to Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. I'm your co-host, Jose Luis Granado Ceja, Mexican journalist living and working here in Mexico City. I'm a staff writer over at Venezuela Analysis, as well as host of their podcast. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Kurt Hackbarth. Kurt Hackbarth, in person. How you doing? Welcome to the show.
Oh, well, I just happened to be in the neighborhood. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, writing for Jacobin magazine in the United States, Sentido Común here in Mexico, and yes, in person, ready for another episode of Soberanía.
All right. Well, we have a great episode today because it's history.
Yeah.
Claudia Sheinbaum is president. Incredible. I mean, so yesterday, that's why Kurt's in town. He came to Mexico City, here to the capital, to participate in the inauguration and all the rest of the pomp and circumstance here in Mexico City. Of course, we went to the Toma de Protesta Popular, the people's oath of office in the Zócalo Square. I guess I'll start there because it was really quite impressive, the turnout. I went to the one with López Obrador 6 years ago, and I wager to say that there was actually more people this time around. It was certainly harder to get downtown than it was 6 years ago. And it really shows the enthusiasm that people have, not just for López Obrador, not just for Morena, but the entire project, right? And everything that it encapsulates. So it was really exciting to see so many people, to see the crowds in the street, the enthusiasm from the people for their new president.
You know, it's really interesting, studying Mexican politics and watching it and, participating. It's really a full contact sport, Mexican politics, in the sense that, the day started yesterday early on. All the camera crews out front of where López Obrador had spent the night. He had left National Palace the day before at 6 o'clock to go and spend the night in an apartment there in Mexico City in the south. Claudia Sheinbaum was in her apartment as well. And the crowd started gathering in front of where AMLO was staying, milling around, mobilizing, massing to say goodbye, to their outgoing president. It was a moving moment. So around 10:30, AMLO makes his way out in his classic everyman Volkswagen Jetta, which he'd become known for. The crowds mass around the car and they have to work their way out, very reminiscent of the scenes in 2018.
Yeah.
So AMLO gets to the Congress first and is greeted by the welcoming committee, and then gets inside the Congress and is just mobbed by the Morena Congress.
Totally breaking protocol.
Just mobbed.
Yeah.
It's a full contact sport here. We saw us towards the end of the campaign, when Claudia was having some of her events downtown, again, just mobbed in a way that I think, it's just hard to contemplate in U.S. terms, right, for presidential candidates. So AMLO slowly kind of wades through that to get up to the podium, because the protocol in Mexico City is you have the passing of the presidential sash. It's the sash that's passed, right? It's passed from the outgoing president to the Speaker of the Chamber of Deputies to the new president, who then makes his, in this case, her address. Then Claudia Sheinbaum leaves a little bit late. And again, the car is surrounded. They have to make their way out. The welcoming committee, the whole welcoming ceremony, right? And then not only did she make one speech yesterday, which was her, protocol speech, which we'll talk about both, in front of the Congress. Then she goes to the Zócalo and gives a whole other much longer speech, right, before the people. So I'm telling you, Mexican politics is not only full contact, but it's mucho aguante.
Yeah. My feet were aching after yesterday, being out there in the crowd. But I'm really glad I was able to participate in that. I think it was a historic moment. I mean, we can't underplay how significant it is that not only the continuity of the project, right, but, Claudia Sheinbaum, the first democratically elected head of state, head of government in all of North America, right? We beat the gringos to it. Canada once had a female prime minister, it's true, but she was not elected and immediately lost the election.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, was a devastating defeat for her party. So I think this is really a trailblazing moment for not just Mexico, but Latin America, and dare I say the world. And I think also because it's not just a woman, we've talked a lot about this before, but it's a woman who represents a project that is committed to improving the welfare of the Mexican people. And I think a lot of the reason why we've seen this kind of enthusiasm is due to that, right? And, it was always kind of an open question, right? What's going to happen without López Obrador? Even just filling the Zócalo. I remember Claudia herself said, when they did that event in March, when the campaign was kicked off, that they were
March
nervous.
1st.
Yeah, they weren't sure if they were going to be able to fill the Zócalo without the help of López Obrador, who obviously did it many, many times in his political history. But sure enough, right? She filled it, and she filled it again yesterday on October 1st when she took office. And of course, speaking of López Obrador, I would be amiss to not mention that we did a special live episode in case you didn't catch that. We did it on Sunday. We had special guests join us as well, talking about the president's life in politics, his legacy. So today we're going to talk about Claudia Sheinbaum. But there we did, of course, give credit where credit is due and did a retrospective on López Obrador. But obviously, we're now in a new chapter here. And of course, today is 2 de octubre. And here in Mexico, we say 2 de octubre, no se olvida. In fact, it was one of the things mentioned in Claudia's very first mañanera. And that was actually something that a lot of our viewers and listeners were wondering about. Will there still be a mañanera? Of course, we've seen this morning that yes, and in fact, with our own touch, a little bit different. There was a great joke that we were reminiscing about where before, López Obrador took his time to answer questions, to say it one way, right? And hers was much more efficient. It's her own style, which I think is appropriate. But the fact is, this is an important communications exercise. In fact, you said it was one of his biggest achievements of breaking the media blockade and actually being able to transmit your message has been an indispensable part of the fourth transformation of Mexico. So it's always been good to see that they're going to continue with this. But of course, we're going to begin with a look at the headlines here. And we have here, very first topic, of course, is the Jacobin article by none other than Kurt Hackbarth, Claudia Sheinbaum, Presidenta. There's a line here from her speech in the Congress that I think really kind of capture things for the program today. So maybe we can start with a breakdown of your piece here, just published today. In fact, working late into the night yesterday, Kurt, to get this story out there. So,
I think it's really symbolic of what the Sheinbaum accent on the Cuatro T, the fourth transformation, is going to be. That's why I started the piece with a quote from her speech in the Congress, which I think is important to read out, so we can get a sense of that there. Maybe we can put that up there on the screen so people can watch it as well. Claudia the president began her speech yesterday with, of course, paying tribute to López Obrador, who was up on the podium with her. And she actually referenced a previous time that AMLO was in the Congress, at the time of the Desafuero in 2004, which we talked about on the live stream, right? When they tried to strip him of his immunity as an elected official on a trumped-up charge in order to disqualify him for running from president in the 2006 election, right? An attempt that ultimately failed, although they then got their revenge in the 2006 electoral fraud. So one of the lines that has become now famous from AMLO's speech before, in front of the Congress at that time was, the history will judge. Right now, today, you're judging me, he said, in this Desafuero affair, but there remains the judgment of history on myself and on you. And she said, history has made its judgment on AMLO and on his presidency, right? And that's why we're here today. So she began with that tribute to López Obrador, and laid out in briefer terms her policy proposals, because that was then expanded upon in the Zócalo. But she also couldn't fail to mention the importance of being the first woman president of Mexico. As López Obrador has mentioned, not only the 200 years of the Republic, but the 300 years of the colonial era before that, run by viceroys appointed by Spain. So we're talking about 503 years and counting until we got to this point, right? And so the president said the following here. Arriving with me are the women who could raise their voices and those who could not, those who had to remain silent and those who shouted alone, the indigenous, the domestic workers who left their pueblos behind to help others, the great-grandmothers who did not learn to read and write because school was not for girls, our aunts who found in solitude the way to be strong, the anonymous women, The anonymous heroes who from their homes, the street, or in the workplace struggled to see this moment. Our mothers who gave us life and then gave it all to us again. Our sisters who with their stories succeeded in emancipating themselves. Our friends and companions. Our beautiful, strong daughters and our grandchildren. They are all arriving, all of them who imagined a future for us where we are free and happy. So this is something that she has mentioned repeatedly, that she as a woman is not arriving alone to the presidency, but all women in Mexico are arriving with her. And in that brief quote that I translated, she took a generational look at that, going back to the great grandmothers, the aunts who in their solitude, her generation, right, of emancipation, right, daughters and grandchildren, right? That's very important. And I think another point to make is, this could just remain in kind of a liberal identity politics kind of model, right? Oh, a woman is coming, how nice. But that can remain in a very, shallow bourgeois level if you don't watch out. So I think it's very important that she mentioned the women in the workplaces who struggled to see this moment, because without there being, and the women from the domestic workers who had to leave their pueblos to go work in the houses of rich people to send money back to their families. If there's not a class aspect to this, it can just remain on that shallow level very, very easily. And I think she's well aware of that there's a movement behind this, so that, the idea is this is a transformation, and it's also the time for women, but not just as a facade, right, Jose Luis?
Absolutely. And, that was probably my favorite part of her speech in the Congress. It's certainly the part that jumped out to me the most, because often, especially in politics, right, it's always about the most visible figures. It's always about the people who are charismatic or who are at the, the front of the stage. But obviously, this is the work of millions of people, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of history behind this moment, and actually making the effort to point out that there's a lot of nameless, unrecognized voices out there. These are the ones who are deserving of attention and of praise. And I think it speaks a lot to who Claudia is as a person, and now as president, of actually emphasizing that this is a collective project, right? We saw this deliberate effort to try to drive a wedge between Claudia and López Obrador, right? And now what we're seeing is that, no, that this is actually something that belongs to all of us, right? And this is something that especially those who contributed in ways that aren't always as visible, right? I think it really speaks to who she is and the kind of governance that I think we should expect from her.
There's been all kinds of attempts to kind of throw Claudia off along the way, right? There was this idea that you mentioned, the worry on March 1st that they weren't going to be able to fill the Zócalo. They did. There was, talk a while back that after some of Moreno's losses in Mexico City in the midterm elections, that maybe she was going to be an electoral liability. And she proved to be anything but with this smashing landslide. During the campaign, there was this attempt to get her to drive a wedge between, or to create an artificial distance between her and López Obrador. She didn't fall for it. And now there's been even the attempt from even nominally left commentators in Mexico to say, for example, she didn't want the judicial reform. López Obrador foisted this on her in his last month in office. And you saw in her speech yesterday before the Congress that she made it a full-throated defense of the judicial reform, And we've also seen, in her gearing up to take office over the last few weeks, she went to the Morena Congress, the Morena National Congress of the Morena Party, and laid out a decalogue of 10 points saying, don't screw this up, Morena. I'm watching you. Don't screw this up, right? And then also, right before the election, the issue with Spain, right? Very briefly, and I talk about this in the Jacobin article, back in 2019, López Obrador sent, a very diplomatic missive to Spain saying, all right, we've got, in a couple of years coming up, the bicentennial of the fall of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1521. Let's do a joint ceremony. Let's do a joint ceremony where you come over here, we both jointly, ask for forgiveness for what happened. You recognize the atrocities of what Spain committed at the time, and it can be a great way of turning the page and renewing our relationship. Sent the letter to the King of Spain, Philip VI, who ignored the letter. Now, he could have said yes, he could have said no, But he chose to ignore the letter and leak the letter to the Spanish press, which then led to a pile-on against Mexico and AMLO from, Spanish monarchists in far-right circles, and there are plenty of that to be had over there in the peninsula. Right?
Even so-called leftists.
Even so, yeah. So, that rankled, obviously. And AMLO had said that, we're going to put a pause on relationship with Spain. Right? Now, Felipe VI has his own bad track record in dealing with, Latin America, right? His father very famously told Hugo Chavez to shut up.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Years back, right?
Yeah.
When then he had to be run out of the, run out of the royal office there for his own corruption. And then his son, over at the inauguration of Gustavo Petro in Colombia, when they brought out the very symbolically important sword of Simon Bolivar, right, the liberator of South America, refused to stand up. And now you've got this Bourbon asshole, who can't even answer a letter. But can leak the letter. So, Claudia Sheinbaum, and this is an example where she went a step further than what AMLO wanted. AMLO said, "I'll just leave it." Basically, you can invite him. And she said, "No. We'll invite the Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez." Didn't invite the king. So the Spanish government then proceeded to get all into a huff about it, sent a formal complaint. Then they could send letters. Yeah. Then they found it within them to be able to write it and send a letter, the formal complaint, right? And decided to not send anyone yesterday to the inauguration. So all of this is by way of saying, and other people came, right? Some people from the Sumar part of the governing coalition, Irene Montero, Gerardo Pizarello, some great voices there have been very critical. But Spain as an actual government blew this one.
Yep.
And all of this is by way of saying, just to kind of set the stage for this episode and what we're going to be talking about Claudia from here on out, is there's been an attempt to, throw Claudia off her game with regards to the election, with regards to filling the Zocalo, with regards to driving a wedge with AMLO, with regards to supposedly being subservient to AMLO, with regards to this, with regards to that. And very quietly, she's been asserting her authority, which really is emblematic of what AMLO said in a seemingly offhanded comment just before he left office that, compared to Claudia, I'm a fresa. A fresa is bougie. He's like, compared to her, I'm bougie. And you can kind of see this, right? Previously, the history of authoritarian Mexican presidents would be that you would have to take office and immediately put someone in jail to assert your authority. Right, Jose Luis?
Right.
You had the famous Quinazo, right, in the days of Salinas de Gortari, right, of the then union leader, right, the corrupt union leader, right? You have Enrique Peña Nieto throwing Elbester Gordillo into jail after he took office in 2012. This was in 2013.
Yeah. Zedillo put Salinas' brother in jail.
That's right, Raul.
Yeah.
Right? So that was the way it used to roll. The incoming president, in order to establish his very authoritarian authority, pardon the redundancia, would find somebody, find some scapegoat to throw him into jail, to say, I'm in charge now. What you see is a different approach from Claudia up till now. She went to Morena and said, shape up, right? She went to, took the reins with Spain and said, we're not going to take this lying down, right? AMLO didn't demand that you apologize. He invited you to apologize in conjunction with Mexico. And it's, I think, important, symbolically important, that one of the last joint acts of AMLO and Sheinbaum together was they went up to the Yaqui community in northern Mexico, which was, an ethnicity that was severely maltreated by the Mexican government, not the Spanish government, the Mexican government, first by Benito Juarez, and then by Porfirio Diaz, the dictator, who displaced the Yaqui community to the Yucatan and made them semi-slaves. So not only were they desterrados, but they were basically enslaved in the Yucatan. So a good act of the AMLO government was to restore them some of their lands, in their ancestral homeland, irrigation and works projects, right? And one of the final acts was AMLO and Claudia together at that event, right? And Claudia made a very important comment about how the act of asking for forgiveness dignifies a people, engrandece was the word she used. It makes it a embiggens, to use
to a
to use a Simpsons term. It embiggens a people, right? And who doesn't want to be embiggened, right? But it's a dignifying force, right? So she was kind of modeling behavior for Spain, right? It was a modeling behavior, right? Like, this is how you do it. Nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing. Zero. So don't come. Don't come. Nobody's going to miss you. Just, fine, right? So this is what has led to yesterday, right? A way of asserting authority in a way that doesn't require these spectacular jailings, but rather a way of asserting power in the public good. Morena has to shape up. Other countries have to respect Mexican sovereignty, etc. Right? And the defense of the judicial reform yesterday. I know I'm extending myself a little bit, but I think these points are important, right? Because it shows who, I think, the mettle, M-E-T-T-L-E, of Claudia as an incoming president, right? And she's not going to let herself be, deviated by these kind of silly, in some cases, attempts to throw her off her game.
Yeah. And in fact, she was asked, what's your priority, right? Like, now you're in office. This is your first full day in office here. And she's like, to get the social programs going as fast as possible, right? Like, instead of cracking down, it's about serving. And then, speaking of cracking down, she's actually directly addressed some of these criticisms, saying that, if that was really an authoritarian, and we're going to get into that in Losers and Haters about this authoritarian backslide in Mexico, which we talked a lot about. She's like, we would have done things the way that Zedillo did it and just clean house at the court. But no, what we want is popularly elected judicial branch, right? So I thought we would also look at a little bit of these headlines that from yesterday here from La Jornada. There were some protests. Of course, there wasn't repression like there was during the Peña Nieto inauguration. Obviously, Sheinbaum saying here she recognizes AMLO and his role in all of this. She talked about the women who were made invisible, the quote that we read. And of course, actually taking office, right? Wearing the presidential sash. And then we wanted to talk about this, where she actually spoke to the people directly, filling the Zócalo. And here the headline says, I will turn over my soul, my life, for the well-being of the people of Mexico, right? That's her message of staying true to what are Morena's founding principles, right? About a fourth transformation, about the public life that is aimed at not private enrichment, but of actually delivering more welfare to the people. And Kurt and I were there. I thought I would share some pictures of that I took of the Zócalo there. You can see it packed. It was actually kind of tricky to get there. And of course, there's a picture. This is as close as we were able to get. But there you can see her behind these flags here, Claudia delivering her 100-point address, really kind of actually emulating López Obrador in a way, who also said, these are my 100 points. These are the things that I want to accomplish. Obviously building on things, but obviously her own touch. I think it was really interesting to hear, for example, the emphasis that she put on the environment and about programs aimed at mitigating the effects of climate change, right? That was one of the things that they tried to point out, saying, oh, well, she's succeeding this oil-loving president and she claims to be a scientist, et cetera, et cetera. I think it was very clear that she has a very sincere commitment to it. And I think that in that sense, we're going to see a little bit of a different policy when it comes to that. There's a lot of talk about investing in renewable energy and all that, but state-led. State-led. That's the key thing, right? They're always staying true to this economic model that López Obrador, that Morena, this government has been trying to develop, that they call Mexican humanism. We have a graphic about that a little bit later that we want to share. But I thought I'd finish just sharing some pictures here of the full Zócalo. It looked like it was going to rain, but it didn't. Some the sunshine breaking through and illuminating the population there that attended. And this was my favorite poster that we saw. And fittingly, it's here in English, to the whole world. This is the true people of Mexico, because of course, what has the coverage been, right? It's been terrible. We've talked a lot about that. But in particular, in the English language media, of trying to portray her as a puppet, and that it's going to be like the early 20th century here in Mexico, where there was a man behind the scenes actually controlling things. That's not the case. And in fact, we should reiterate this, because in fact, the opposition makes this point all the time. That's a sexist comment, right? This idea that a woman can't govern on her own, that she's going to need a man behind her. It's absurd. And it's really disappointing to see women opposition leaders using this kind of language. Hopefully they'll come around and see that López Obrador is retiring and the person who is firmly in charge is Claudia Sheinbaum.
I think that's going to be pretty clear pretty quickly.
Yeah.
that she's in charge, right? The other bit of graffiti that I like, well, this isn't graffiti, but there was a bit of graffiti on the wall as we were walking in, which was "Mata tu gringo interior,"
Yeah.
kill your inner gringo. Yeah, it's like working on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And well, I thought we would spend some time here. Kurt, you've done a good job of going through all of her commitments, everything that she's promised to address when it comes to her agenda, her priorities as now the president of Mexico. I'm still getting used to that, la presidenta, and she emphasizes that it's not female president, it's presidenta con A, and in fact mentioned that in her address, both in the Congress and in the Zócalo, really making an emphasis of the fact that, like, she said, like the engineers, like the firefighters, right? Like, there's a reason what isn't named is made invisible, so we have to say it.
Going back to the point of invisibility, right, that she had talked about in that quote that you mentioned at the beginning of the program. So there's a lot to unpack with this 100-point plan, and we'll be coming back to this in future episodes as it's rolled out, right? But what we see is a continuity with the Cuatro T, with the first administration, in the sense that all of the existing programs will be continued, right? The work now is to expand upon them, right? And one clear example of that is the universal pension that AMLO rolled out for all 65 and over. That's going to be lowered for women down to 60 in progressive terms, right? To recognize the fact that women, in a lot of cases, has child rearing and caregiving and a lot of other things, having to care for aged parents. A lot of times, not had the opportunity to build up some kind of retirement savings. And now, after the privatization of the pension system in the 90s, practically none of us have been able to build up any kind of retirement savings. So donate to Soberanía. That wasn't a planned pitch, but so the retirement age, to be able to get the public pension for women down to 60. That's an example of how an existing program will be expanded. Another one is the scholarship program that was begun by López Obrador, these stay-in-school scholarships. That's now going to be extended to every child in public schools. Every child in public schools. So it's going to start with secondary or middle school students and then be extended down to elementary school students. So the point is, if you're in school, you'll get a scholarship, and that's important because anyone who's been in and out of Mexican schools, that a lot of times kids arrive without having eaten a thing, without, or having to, if they're older, having to work, or not sleep or whatever else, and just having a little money in your pocket can help them to buy your materials and everything else you need, and be able to actually just have a little bit of breathing room to be able to actually study.
Yeah.
Very important.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a difference. As someone with 2 kids in school, right? One is actually now in the equivalent of high school here in Mexico, and that, of course, is a public institution and receives that scholarship. And it makes a huge difference, right, in terms of just even being able to pay for the bus so they can get to school every day and have a healthy lunch and all these kinds of things. That's what universal social programs are. Yeah. Right? That's why they're now constitutional rights. These aren't handouts from the state. This is your right. And part of guaranteeing your right to education is about making sure that those barriers are lifted. And so I'm really encouraged by that. And, for all of the haters out there who are worried about what this impact is going to be on public finances, right? Because that's one of the things, right? Oh, she's going to have to tame this deficit, actually. López Obrador did not run a deficit for the first 5 years, ran one in this last year only to make sure that many of the projects were able to finish. But largely the finances are in a good state, and things are going to be slowly rolled out to make sure that, that it is sustainable. Maybe it'll prompt to finally something that much on the left has been asking for as well, which is a fiscal reform. Now that the judicial reform has been done, maybe it's time for a tax reform. It'd be good to see as well. The other thing I would mention that I really highlighted for me during her 100-point speech, one would be the expansion of rail lines for passengers.
Yeah.
It was something that was very common in Mexico until the neoliberal era, where everything was privatized and eventually eliminated, about rescuing that and using a more sustainable, efficient mode of transportation instead of these, private monopoly bus lines that charge exorbitant rates to be able to transport yourself throughout the country. And the other one would be a commitment to the 40-hour work week. Mm-hmm. And that was something that
very important.
Morena had playing with, but obviously we have to say it, right? It looks like some of the legislators kind of succumb to that pressure from the business sector, from the bourgeoisie here in Mexico. So she did say, we will have the 40-hour work week. She did add, saying by the end of her term, which means that that's up to us, right? To put the pressure on, to say that, no, this needs to happen early, because this is about giving back basically on the entire day to the Mexican working class so that they can spend time with their families and enjoy their livelihood, et cetera, right? Not working 6 days a week, because a lot of people don't even realize that. In Mexico, we have a 6-day work week. It's absurd, right? So we really need to work on that. And I think it's going to be an important test of her. And I think, well, that kind of brings me to one point that I wanted to talk about, hear your thoughts on this, Kurt, which is that, right, it's very early. We're on day 2 of her presidency. But I think the real test is going to come with the first crisis, right? Where is it going to come from? Is it going to be manufactured? Is it going to be an organic one? Or is it going to come from abroad? Is it going to be with a security issue? I think that'll be really the moment we see what is Claudia Sheinbaum, Presidenta, going to be like when it comes to her first crisis. And we'll see where it comes from. Obviously, we'll talk about it here on the program if and when it does come. But I think that's something to watch out for. What is her governing style in the moment, in the hard times, right? Right now, things are good. You have the supermajority, et cetera, et cetera. But, it may not always be that way, or she will govern well and strengthen in the midterms. But I think it's important to pay attention. But so far, it's looking very positive.
Well, she will have some early tests. We'll see what crises come up, right? Just today, as we're recording this program, she's off to Acapulco, dealing with the effects of Hurricane John there. Poor Acapulco. And this is twice now in 2 years. Last year was Hurricane Otis, that came out of nowhere to turn into a Category 5 hurricane, to be the strongest storm to ever hit that section of the coast. And losers and haters were out there saying, "Oh, this is going to be devastating for AMLO," and they played up all the pictures of his car getting stuck in the mud as he was going out to to oversee the relief efforts, and this and that. It turns out that Acapulco in that area voted overwhelmingly for Morena in this election, as a testament to how the recovery efforts were undertaken after the 2023 hurricane. But this is the second shot there, and that's going to be, as I put in the Jacobin piece today, rather kind of an involuntary backdrop to her climate agenda, right? That has to be going on. Another thing that we're going to see coming up, she said in the first month, she wants to start working on the water issue, and that means revising the whole legal structure that has led to the abuse of water licenses and concessions, dating back to the Salinas de Gortari period of the neoliberal era, the late 80s and early 90s. I have another Jacobin piece on that. Basically, it privatized water in Mexico and created a whole generation of what are called the water millionaires, where wealthy Mexicans and wealthy corporations and wealthy multinationals sucked up water licenses and been able to suck just egregious amounts of water out of Mexican soil, leading to a tiny part of it being used for domestic use. And this whole past few months, it's raining now, but the early year we had a terrible drought over the whole country. That has to be changed, and that has to be changed at the legislative level, not just kind of going in and tinkering at it, but changing how the whole water licensing system has, and going in there and removing concessions that were acquired through fraud or illegal procedures. Really clean that up, and that is going to get a lot of pushback from the U.S.
Oh,
right?
Absolutely.
Now, Lopez Obrador, just as he was going out the door, declared the Calixca quarry over in Cantina Roo, which was owned by Vulcan Materials, a limestone quarry, which is terribly contaminating, a natural protected reserve area. Right, this is over by the Cozumel, by Playa del Carmen. This is kind of like the only area that a lot of people know of Mexico. Basically, this Vulcan Materials was soil, just tearing out to get to the limestone there. AMLO tried to get to an agreement with them and said, "Look, let's try to fix this, or we'll buy it." Nothing. They didn't want to. They went to international, courts, whatever else. Ignored Mexican courts,
which is worth pausing on, right? Because this is why they love these international courts, because they know they're going to win there. Because they are not fair tribunals. They're not spaces where there's actually a deliberation of the arguments. It's basically a mechanism to ensure the continued plunder of resources in the global South. Let's be honest about what these are. That's why they were so confident about going there. But Lopez Obrador had that surprise for them, saying, "Oh yeah, well, you've been expropriated."
Right. So it turned into a natural reserve area, which led to the illustrious Republican senator from Alabama said there's going to be crushing consequences from this. So I think an early challenge of the Sheinbaum administration is going to be, don't make the rookie mistake of caving to all these, baleful headlines, and all this bluster, from a United States which is very distracted on the world scene and is not in a position to follow through like it says it does in a lot of this, but they'll try. They'll try to see if they can just make Scheinbaum bend just with rhetoric. I don't think so, but they're going to try that. So we've got the hurricane issue, we've got the water issue, and mining related stuff in general, like with Kalixka, and the violence issue. We talked about on a previous show the whole abduction/arrest of Mayo Zambada, the former leader of the Sinaloa cartel. Jose Luis pointed out very correctly that while U.S. DAs, district attorneys get flashy headlines out of this, and the kingpin strategy makes splashy news in the United States, it's the Mexicans who are on this side of the border that pay the price. So we've seen over 100 people killed so far, and the violence related to that in Culiacan, Sonora. Right, a real flashpoint there. Meanwhile, at the other end of the country, as I've reported on in Jacobin as well, we have a fight with two cartels over the lucrative black market border trade from Guatemala into Chiapas. Which is kind of lit the spark that lit the match with regards to long simmering tensions in the state and a lot of gun ownership there, and social tensions, and going back to the colonial era in Chiapas, right? So you've seen that some Mexicans have even had to cross the border into Guatemala temporarily, right? So those are kind of two flashpoints that she's going to have to deal with very quickly as well. So there's not going to be any lack of trials for her going forward, I think.
Yeah. I think maybe one final point that I would say about being in the Zócalo and talking with people and seeing the enthusiasm is that, while this is obviously something that is, interested in taking state power and using the mechanisms of the state, taking government and using it to the advantage of the people, this is also a mass movement, right? Morena was founded as a social movement first, then became a political party. And I think we're likely going to see that kind of mobilization element continuing through, right? We saw the turnout yesterday, and I think it bodes well in terms of in these moments where there will be a test of Claudia Sheinbaum's government, that she'll be able to rely on mass mobilization the way that López Obrador did, right? When push comes to shove, it's going to be another tool to be able to say, the people are with me, they support these decisions. And I think that's what will allow for a deepening of the fourth transformation, what she calls the second floor, going further than we've already gone so far with the previous government now.
Just a very quick point, too. One thing we did notice when we were on the Zócalo yesterday was that President Sheinbaum accompanied her 100-point plan with really interesting images and video work on big screens. Yeah. So you could notice the production work with regards to communication strategy. Each one of her 100 points was also accompanied by video or images, whatever else.
Yeah. Lots of train horns. Mm-hmm. Yeah, lots of train horns. Before we move on to a look at her first Mañanera, I thought I'd bring up this Seth Harp. He's a contributing writer over at Rolling Stone, one of the few gringo journalists out there who actually see things for what they are. And I thought I'd read this out for those of you who are just joining us on audio. You'd think that the U.S. media would take an interest in Claudia Sheinbaum's inauguration as the first woman and first Jewish head of state in North America. But she actually cares about poor people and the environment, as well as Palestine. So they see her as fundamentally unserious person. And then he's followed this by saying, as an American accustomed to a dumber discourse, I was amazed that Sheinbaum spoke for a full hour, laid out 100 plus policy programs, and didn't flub a single word. I'm not used to seeing a politician speak at length with such energy, intelligence, eloquence, and substance. That's a great review. And the truth is, she's really improved. She's gotten much, much better at communicating with the crowd. In fact, during her campaign kickoff, she did have a flub, missaying something at the beginning of her speech. We didn't see that this last time. I think it's really helped. She did this whole tour in this transition period with López Obrador, and I think you can really tell. And she's really, kind of filling in to her position quite well, I think.
And I think it's a really important point that Seth points out. If she were part of kind of the Hillary Clinton, Kamala Harris, neoliberal international bourgeoisie, imagine the headlines there'd be about this, right? But she's not the right kind of woman for them. She's not the right type of woman for them.
Yeah. They speak nicely of Giorgia Meloni, who's an actual fascist over there in Italy, but a progressive woman, God forbid. And speaking of progressive, right, I saw this coming out from her, which is just a summary here in Spanish, gives you an idea of what are the guiding principles of this this is the term that Lopez Obrador emerged about 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, saying this is what we call it Mexican humanism, shared prosperity. There cannot be a rich government and a poor people. The people who govern must be honest and truthful. Democracy is the government of the people, for the people, and by the people. It is prohibido prohibir, which is a saying here in Spanish, which is basically you can't. It's a comment, a saying against authoritarianism.
Prohibition is prohibited. Prohibiting to prohibit.
There you go. Thanks for bailing me out on that one.
I don't know if I made that any clearer. You are prohibited to prohibit prohibition.
Right.
Yeah.
It's there's songs that mention it.
Yeah.
Right. Development and welfare, substantive equality. Should mention that she has gender parity on her cabinet as well.
And it's important to point out there that because AMLO proposed his 20 constitutional reforms, which are going through right now. A Sheinbaum one is the Mexican version of the Equal Rights Amendment. She wants an Equal Rights Amendment for Mexico, but unlike the United States, in Mexico it's going to be ratified. Yeah. So that Mexico is going to have its ERA, and there's also going to be a cabinet-level secretariat for women's affairs, and that's going to be Citlali Hernandez, the former senator, who's going to be running that over there.
Yeah. And then finally, just to wrap up here, our favorite, of course, Mexico es un país soberano. Mexico is a sovereign country, independent and democratic.
Soberanía.
Politics should be done with love, not with hate. And we condemn classism, machismo, and any form of discrimination. So, there are still people out there who are trying to pretend like Morena, like Claudia, is not a progressive, is not a leftist. They always put it in square quotes. If that's the guiding principles of what they call Mexican humanism, it sounds progressive to me.
Yeah, but they'll always find a way to poo-poo something and say, "Oh, it's not this, it's not that." It's a way of not engaging. If you condemn beforehand, you're not engaging with what's going on down here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Although I do wonder what sort of the anti-AMLO intelligentsia is going to do now, right? They were driven by hatred of AMLO. And AMLO is no longer the president. In fact, there were protests yesterday from the judicial branch workers. And, they were chanting, dictador, dictador, to a man who was literally no longer president anymore. So some dictatorship.
Yeah.
All right. So we want to also talk about her first mañanera. So like we said, there was a lot of questions. Is it going to go on? She has committed to carrying through the mañanera, but with her own touch, which is nice to see. It's shorter, which is nice. It was about an hour and a half this morning. She was very, sharp on saying only 5 questions. And of course, the last question was our friend Vicente Serrano from Sin Censura. So of course, the popular communicators, the YouTubers, to use a different term, people like us, I guess, were also participating as well, right? Opening the doors to different forms of journalism. So it was good to see that. There was also kind of a different audio-visual element. They did a whole video on El 2 de Octubre. Claudia Sheinbaum is very much from the student movement. So it was good to see her recognizing, this historic date in Mexico. And of course, for those of you who are not familiar, in 1968, there was a brutal repression of violent, murderous repression by the state against the demonstration in Tlatelolco, where it's hard to say exactly how many were killed, but from hundreds, possibly thousands, ordered by then President Díaz Ordaz. And in fact, today, Claudia Sheinbaum signed a decree accepting that this was a crime against humanity, and actually pointing out that this was carried out by the state, carried out by the then president, that it's a stain on the history of Mexico. But I think most importantly, to all of those critics out there who keep accusing the Mexican government of being authoritarian, said that we commit to never again doing something like this, never again repressing the people in the way that was. So of course, today being 2 de Octubre, October 2nd, it's important to that. And that's how the morning press conference started. And in fact, there was a whole video kind of elaborating the history of that. Her mother was active in that student movement. Claudia Sheinbaum was active in the student movement when she was in university. And so it was good to see that kind of her own touch. And in fact, every day is going to kind of have like a theme and responding to, what her priorities are. In fact, there was one that I think Wednesdays is exposing the lies.
Right.
I think it's Tuesday that is historic memory, right? Like bringing back, remembering these moments in our history that are often covered up or hidden or suppressed about that history of struggle that makes us proud to be Mexicans.
I think Thursdays is going to be notable women, which
Oh,
is
yeah.
important,
Of
right?
course.
And one on Monday, which I found to be interesting, is going to be about healthy living, which is something I think
Oh, yeah.
not a kind of a topic that you'd see with AMLO, right? Which has to do with food and food practices. That is so important. And we, I think we all know how big ag and big food, fills our food with, chemicals and substances and, dyes and all kinds of stuff that not only, creates an obesity crisis as exists in Mexico, but it also is, it's actually very physically harmful. I mean, some of the stuff is very toxic. So I think putting an emphasis on that kind of thing is another kind of a Scheinbaum emphasis here. And just to make a point that I think is, we were talking about Spain and the act of how, asking for forgiveness in Biggins, right, with regards to the Yaqui. Here's another example. Beginning her administration by accepting the responsibility of the Mexican government in the 1968 massacre.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Mm-hmm. The U.S. should acknowledge its responsibility for participating in that behind the scenes.
Yeah. Yeah. Often not said as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm feeling encouraged. Like I said, it's only day 2, so we'll see how things go. And obviously there's a lot more ahead of us. But again, I would emphasize, the fact that it's continuity, but with a different kind of touch, right? And not necessarily a feminine touch. I don't want to be flippant about it, right? But also, I think, in a country that does have a long legacy of sexism and discrimination, to have that emphasis on women, the way that we opened the show talking about, the invisibilized people in the history of Mexico, all of that, and even just the fact that there's a woman at the dais now addressing, right? So I'm feeling positive and look forward to what comes next.
And you mentioned before, too, that they tried to throw her off a little bit with a question from Xochitl Gálvez that she batted back pretty well.
Right? That's right. Yeah, so Xochitl Gálvez ends up writing a letter. It's interesting how she really drank her own Kool-Aid. She seems to think that she has more influence than she does. The other day she was talking about starting
former presidential candidate Xochitl Gálvez, right?
Yeah. Former losing brutally. Saying, are you going to move past the polarization and the division that López Obrador, sowed throughout the country? And she's like, hang on, why don't we pull up these recent this recent poll that was published? And in that poll, right, people say that, do you think the words of López Obrador are encouraging, that they're good for the country? And over 60%. And then when they ask the same thing of Claudia Sheinbaum, do you think Claudia Sheinbaum's positions and all this is positive for the country? It was above 70%, right? So what polarization?
It was really interesting that AMLO's rhetoric actually was seen as uniting the country.
Yeah.
Quite the opposite of what they've been saying.
Yeah. Yeah. So keep that in mind when you read the mainstream media coverage of this, right? And anything you read today, obviously reflecting on yesterday's historic moment, I'll say the same thing, right? What is she going to do in terms of the polarization or the division or the what's the other one that she's going to be a puppet, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, kind of really downplaying the significance of it, right? I remember even reading an article where like the Jewish community in Mexico is kind of washing their hands of her and that they don't feel represented by her and things like that, right? Anyway, on and on about these kinds of efforts to minimize what is really quite a historic day for the country. All right. In these last 10 minutes, we want to bring you losers and haters.
LNH.
We have a really special one for you today. Mexico's democratic disaster. So you just finished to us listening 50 minutes talking about Mexico's democratic advancements. All right. Like Claudia Sheinbaum is president today, thanks to voters being able to participate freely and fairly in an election and electing and choosing continuity and choosing Claudia Sheinbaum, the first woman, first minority, Jewish minority president, et cetera, et cetera. But according to the Journal of Democracy, it's a democratic disaster. And of course, what is it about? It's about the judicial reform. We talked about that just now, just saying that judicial reform, if it was really interested in, rolling back democracy in this country, would have done what the neoliberals did. No. But this is an interesting, so this is by Amrit Singh and Gianmarco Coronado Gracchi.
Oh my God. The country's outgoing president is determined to bulldoze Mexico's judicial system. Bulldoze!
And look,
disaster!
It's even worse than people realize. Incredible. I mean, it's the same old usual, blah, blah, blah. But there's a couple of lines here that I think is interesting to kind of break through. All right. Where there's a section here where there's just like one lie after another. Here it is. AMLO's ruling party, Morena, rammed Plan C through Congress without deliberation and adopted the constitutional amendments in just 8 days. So Sentence one of that paragraph is a lie.
False.
False.
Mhm.
Plain up. Sure, the actual legislative process took 8 days, but there was months of on the street consultations promoting this, receiving feedback. In fact, it went through many changes. It's not the original proposal.
Forums in Congress.
Yeah, forums in Congress. Parlamento Abierto is the way it's called here. And, what's going on here? 55,000 federal journalists went on strike, a paid strike, which is not actually a strike, right? And they weren't actually protesting their bosses. This was an active protest, which obviously they're free to do, but to call it a strike as if it was, the working class resisting the brutal government repression, of course not. The peso plummeted. It dropped slightly, and then it recovered. So,
but we see, let's look at this language: bulldoze, disaster, plummeted. Do you think we're that dumb to fall for the sensationalistic language? Who are your editors?
Yeah.
What kind of journalism is this?
Oh, we'll get to that. I'll tell you who the editors are in just a second.
Okay. All right, good.
Protests rack the country for weeks.
Disaster, bulldoze.
With protesters even breaking into the Senate. I guess the journal Democracy is in favor of riots inside of the hallowed halls of democratic deliberation? Guess so. In response to the attempted destruction!
Bulldoze!
And this is my favorite part. Again, Democratic checks move to stop AMLO. 3 federal judges issued injunctions to prevent Congress and the president from enacting the reforms, but to no avail. In an ominous signal for the rule of law, Congress and López Obrador ignored all 3.
Now, this is the most blatant lie of all. If these authors had taken 5 minutes to read the Mexican Constitution and read the law, they would have known those injunctions were illegal. They were illegal. The Amparo law. Did you guys read the law of Amparo in Mexico? Did you read it? One of the clauses specifically says is you cannot use an Amparo injunction against constitutional reforms. They were trying to use an injunction to freeze the debate in Congress. You can't do that. Sorry, it's illegal. Sorry, do your research, do your homework.
And then tried to stop its publication, remember?
Right, yeah.
It's just, wow, these Amparos are powerful. Wow, you asked, who's editing this? Let's scroll to the very bottom. Who edits this?
Who would it be?
Oh, it's the National Endowment for Democracy. I mean, the Journal of Democracy, paid for by a CIA cutout. Yeah, the NED. So, not to be taken seriously. So, there's your losers and your haters, but we got you something else this week, and I thought I would mention this here. Progressive Magazine just published this from Alexander Main and Hillary Goodfriend, which the headline says it all. Let Mexico reform its judiciary. Advocacy against judicial changes from the United States and elsewhere is inappropriate and unwarranted. It's an excellent piece. We'll include Kurt's Jacobin piece in the description below, but we'll throw this one in as well. Give it a read. This is an honest, fair assessment of what this actually is. Not the scaremongering, not the alarmist words and the language and trying to promote the interests of U.S. capital because it feels threatened because they're not going to be able to buy off their judges here anymore. This is an honest evaluation of what it actually is. And in fact, I know we've talked about this a lot, but I almost have a sense of pride, right? Yeah, this is a big country, There's 130 million people are engaging in an exercise of actually expanding democracy. And you'd think that the Journal of Democracy would be in favor of that, but they're not.
Disaster, bulldoze, rocked.
And instead, we get this kind of language. But there is actually something really interesting happening here, and I think it's going to be successful. And I'm all in favor of being able to vote for the judges. I'm going to vote for the judges that protect human rights, not for the ones that protect corporate interests. All right, so we've reached the end of the program here, and I thought we would wrap up with this image here. This is from De Raíz Media, local media outlet here in Mexico, a cartoon. The image of a young girl wearing the presidential sash, holding a little AMLito in her arms, and there's a voice in off saying, "Are you playing that you're going to be Miss Universe in the future?" And she says, "No, to be president."
Right.
And that's what it matters. That really does matter, right? Like, again, not to fall into the trap of liberal identity politics. Oh, a woman. We've had Margaret Thatcher, Giorgia Meloni's, we talked about this. But to have a woman like Claudia Sheinbaum, who comes from the streets, who comes from the social movements, right? We've seen so many images of her, knocking on doors with the party newspaper in her arms. And now she's president. And that's the kind of person that I think is absolutely the role model for young women in particular here in Mexico. There are, you never heard Claudia talk about the glass ceiling, and you never says, "Oh, I arrived and I'm breaking these barriers," the way that Norma Piña did. Always talking about llegamos todas. All of us have arrived together. But nonetheless, it is really significant. And I think being in the crowd and seeing the enthusiasm of the population for su presidenta is really quite emotional for me. And I'm glad we were able to be there.
And don't forget as well that we're going to have Clara Brugada as the governor of Mexico City, Luis René Alcalde is the head of Morena, and also, Mexico has gender parity in the cabinet and in the Congress. So Mexico is well ahead of the United States in terms of gender parity. Right? That's the context in which, this idea of it's a time of transformation and it's a time for women. It's not just Claudia Sheinbaum.
That's right. That's right. All right. Well, we've reached the end of another program. We thought we'd make this focus. There's still some more things we want to talk about. Obviously, the anniversary of the forced disappearance of the 43 students from Ayotzinapa passed last week. We do want to talk about that. That is something that is pending. López Obrador made a 100-point commitment. One of those was to clear up what happened. It's one of the things he wasn't able to accomplish, and that is something that falls to Claudia. And the same demands fall on her to make sure that there is clarity on it. But we're going to talk more about that, as well as some of the reforms that we haven't had a chance to get into, the National Guard, the reform around extending sujetos de derecho, or basically kind of granting collective rights to indigenous populations and to Afro-descendant populations here in Mexico, which I think is worth digging into, and a number of others, right? Like there's 20 that are proposed, there's some that are a priority. We're going to be moving through those, so we'll get to those later, but we wanted to spend this program talking about Claudia because it's history. Any last words, Kurt?
That's it, Jose Luis. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, here up in Mexico City. And we have enjoyed being on the same set for this episode. We'll try to be doing it more often. We're also going to try to do more live streams and Q&As because it seems like that went really well the last time. So we'll be seeing you soon for another episode of Soberanía.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Of course, like and subscribe, share with your friends. It really helps us out. And thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.